On July 27, 1953, three commanders signed a ceasefire in Korea. Not a peace treaty, a ceasefire. South Korea refused to sign. That legal gap now dictates where 28,500 American troops are stationed, why Pyongyang built nuclear weapons, and how the rivalry between the US and China plays out across Asia. How does a war end on the battlefield, but never end politically? The answer starts in 1945, but the real turning point came much later. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the Korean peninsula found itself divided in two. The 38th parallel, drawn hastily by US officials, became the dividing line. Soviet troops occupied the north, while American forces took charge in the south. This was meant as a temporary fix, a practical solution to manage the withdrawal of Japanese soldiers and civilians. But the split quickly hardened. In the north, Soviet authorities dismantled Japanese institutions and installed Korean communists, including Kim Il-sung, a guerrilla leader with backing from Moscow. Land was redistributed, and a new political order took shape, echoing the Soviet model. South of the 38th parallel, the US military government kept many Japanese administrators in place at first, aiming for stability, but also sowing early distrust among Koreans. American officials promoted a market economy and began building democratic institutions, but they also cracked down on leftist movements, fearing the spread of communism. By 1948, two rival states had formally emerged: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, led by Kim Il-sung, and the Republic of Korea in the south, led by Syngman Rhee. Each claimed to be the only legitimate government for all of Korea. Tensions simmered along the 38th parallel. Diplomatic efforts to unify the peninsula failed, and both governments built up their militaries. On June 25, 1950, the fragile balance shattered. North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel at dawn, launching a full-scale invasion. The conflict that erupted would not only devastate the peninsula, but also draw in outside powers, transforming a civil struggle into a global flashpoint. The choices made in those first 5 years, occupation, division, and the creation of two rival regimes, set the stage for a war that would never truly end. The Korean War, which began as a civil conflict, quickly became a global confrontation. When North Korean forces swept south in June 1950, the United Nations, led by the United States, rushed in to defend the Republic of Korea. By September of 1950, General MacArthur's bold amphibious landing at Incheon reversed the tide. UN troops recaptured Seoul and pushed deep into the north, advancing toward the Yalu River and the Chinese border. But this rapid progress brought new risks. In October 1950, China intervened, sending hundreds of thousands of People's Volunteers across the Yalu. Their sudden arrival stunned UN forces, who were forced into a long and bloody retreat. By early 1951, the front lines had solidified along a jagged line close to the original 38th parallel. Both sides launched major offensives, but neither could break the deadlock. Seoul changed hands 4 times in a single year. The war's intensity was staggering. By the end of 1951, combined military and civilian casualties had already reached into the millions. The United States, China, and the two Koreas, all recognized that further advances would mean only more devastation, not victory. The conflict settled into a grinding stalemate. Trenches, barbed wire, and artillery duels defined daily life along the front. The cost of continuing was clear, but neither side would accept defeat. This exhaustion on the battlefield forced leaders to consider a different kind of solution, a legal pause if not a political peace. Armistice talks began in July 1951, but the guns continued to fire for 2 more years. The war's transformation from mobile battles to a static, fortified front made the question unavoidable. If neither side could win outright, could the fighting at least be stopped? The answer would shape the next 70 years of Korean and global security. The Korean Armistice Agreement, signed on July 27, 1953, drew a sharp line across the peninsula but left the war unresolved. Unlike a peace treaty, an armistice is a military pause, a legal stop to fighting, not an end to the conflict itself. The agreement created a demilitarized zone, DMZ, stretching roughly 250 kilometers and measuring 4 kilometers wide, 2 kilometers on each side of the military demarcation line. This buffer is patrolled, mined, and ringed with barbed wire, standing as a physical reminder that hostilities were only suspended, not settled. The document's signatories were the United Nations Command, led by the United States, the Korean People's Army, and the Chinese People's Volunteers. South Korea's president, Syngman Rhee, refused to sign, arguing that the armistice locked in division and undermined the goal of reunification. As a result, South Korea remains beamed outside the agreement, a fact that still shapes legal and diplomatic debates today. To monitor the ceasefire, the armistice established 2 key oversight bodies. The Military Armistice Commission, made up of senior officers from each side, investigates violations and coordinates responses. Alongside it, the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, originally staffed by Sweden, Switzerland, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, inspects troop movements and military installations within the DMZ. Neither body has the power to enforce decisions, but both provide crucial channels for communication and crisis management. The architecture of the armistice, with its buffer zones and oversight commissions, institutionalized the pause in fighting, but left the political questions hanging. The war, in legal terms, remains on hold. Artillery fire erupted over Yeonpyeong Island on November 23, 2010. Dozens of shells crashed into civilian neighborhoods and military outposts, leaving buildings in flames and sending residents scrambling for cover. The barrage killed 2 South Korean Marines and 2 civilians, wounding more and forcing a mass evacuation. South Korean forces returned fire, and the peninsula braced for possible escalation. This was not an isolated border clash. It was a stark reminder that the armistice is not a shield against real violence. Incidents like Yeonpyeong reveal how the Korean War's unresolved status remains a tool for leaders on both sides. In the north, state media pointed to the shelling as proof of their resolve against what they called provocation from the south. In Seoul, the government condemned the attack, raised its military alert, and called for international support, reinforcing the narrative of a constant threat from Pyongyang. Each side used the crisis to justify military spending, tighten security laws, and rally domestic support. The DMZ, lined with mines and guard towers, is more than a relic. It is a living fault line. Every incident, whether a firefight or a diplomatic standoff, is amplified by the unfinished war. The unresolved conflict feeds a cycle. Flashpoints become political leverage, and political narratives keep the front tense. The Yeonpyeong shelling was a warning that the absence of peace is not the same as peace itself. The next escalation could come at any moment, especially as new weapons raise the stakes even higher. North Korea's first nuclear test on October 9, 2006, sent shockwaves across Asia. Underground tremors registered on seismographs from Seoul to Tokyo. The test shattered assumptions that the peninsula's stalemate would remain conventional. Pyongyang declared its nuclear arsenal a necessary shield against regime change, while Washington, Seoul, Tokyo, Beijing, and Moscow scrambled to respond. Within weeks, the 6-party talks resumed in Beijing, aiming to trade denuclearization for security guarantees and economic aid. But the process quickly ran into the same wall that had blocked progress for years: sequencing. North Korea insisted on sanctions relief and security assurances before any irreversible steps. The United States and its partners demanded the opposite: verifiable dismantlement first, and then rewards. Temporary breakthroughs flickered. The 2005 joint statement saw North Korea pledge to abandon its nuclear programs in exchange for energy aid and diplomatic normalization. Yet deadlines slipped, and trust evaporated. By 2009, following a series of missile launches and a second nuclear test on May 25th, North Korea walked away from the talks entirely. Later, the Sunshine Policy of inter-Korean engagement produced historic moments, summits, family reunions, even joint Olympic teams, but it could not survive nuclear brinkmanship and shifting domestic priorities on both sides of the border. Each failed round left the region more anxious and less trusting, as the nuclear shadow grew longer. The cycle of escalation, negotiation, and collapse became the new normal. The question lingers, can any agreement stick when neither side believes the other will go first? Nearly 70 years after the guns fell silent, the Korean Peninsula remains a focal point for the world's great powers. About 28,500 United States troops are stationed in South Korea today, not as a relic of the past, but as a living guarantee, part of a mutual defense pact that ties the peninsula's fate to American security strategy across the Pacific. The United States views its presence here as essential, both to deter renewed conflict and to assure allies that it will stand firm against any aggression. This forward deployment also sends a clear signal to China, whose own interests are inseparable from the fate of the peninsula. For Beijing, the border with North Korea is more than a line on a map. It is a buffer that insulates northeastern China from forces aligned with the United States. The Chinese government has repeatedly voiced concern that a sudden collapse of North Korea or a unified Korea friendly to the United States could bring American troops and advanced weaponry right to its doorstep. As a result, China supports stability in Pyongyang, even as it occasionally joins international calls for restraint. Japan, meanwhile, faces the threat of North Korean missiles that can reach its cities in minutes. This persistent danger has driven Tokyo to revise its defense policies, expanding its military capabilities and deepening security partnerships with both the United States and South Korea. The unresolved Korean War, then, is not just a bilateral standoff. It is a linchpin in the regional security order, shaping alliance planning, military budgets, and diplomatic maneuvering from Washington to Beijing to Tokyo. The stakes stretch far beyond the demilitarized zone, making the peninsula a barometer for the balance of power in East Asia. The line dividing Korea is not just a border, it is unfinished business on the world stage. As rival alliances harden and nuclear risks grow, this unresolved war still dictates Asia's security architecture. How a military stalemate became a political deadlock remains a defining question for the region's future. Share your perspective below.